So the last strand of theories I really want to talk about in this recording are, critical theories, post-colonial theories, and risk theory. So again, all of these will be a strand of theories, but under each of these broader strands, you'll find several existing theories. So if we can start with critical theories, these are really theories which challenge existing structures by asking who holds power and who benefits from the way an organization is functioning. So critical theories mostly are really about power. And there are many different critical theories. You might consider things like Marxist theories, theories which have to do with political economy, feminist theories, and under feminist theories, you'll still find different styles of doing feminism. So you will find things like intersectionality, and that might fall under feminism at some point if you want to consider, different markers of identity, such as age, gender, and I don't know, race and ethnicity, and how all those get to put people in different boxes of marginalization. So we are not again covering all existing critical theories here, but as you can see, the whole idea of critical theory really is trying to challenge power and where power relations might be causing problems. Things like, queer theories when it comes to LGBTQ plus, theories challenging white privileges and white um, supremacy in particular, theories challenging the hegemony in general, theories challenging all sorts of discrimination you can ever imagine, which are related to power, are things we are considering under critical theory. So if we can take neo-Marxism as one example of critical theory, can say that this is really rooted in Marxist thoughts. And this is just examining how power and wealth are distributed among people working in the same organizations. It is particularly useful in analyzing how organizations treat workers and how economic structures get to influence service delivery. So, for example, if we can think in the aged care sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, um, we saw, and this actually highlighted the over-reliance on underpaid migrant workers. And critical theory gives us the language to really, really get to develop this understanding and challenge it as much as we can. Migrant workers as people who might be not so much privileged in Australia, who might be among those who earn, the least in the country, and so on and so forth. And we can even extend this example to the current developments in Australian migration system, the increase on the money people have to pay to get a skilled migration visa, and the implications that's having actually on the workforces and the potential shortage we might end up having in the workforce in the near future just because of these development. We can think during COVID-19, the closure of borders, how this has exacerbated workforces shortage, and absolutely, this revealed a systemic inequities in how people are treated in different organizations, including in the pay rate and working conditions. And if we can think of the aged care sector, which we are mostly discussing about this week, we can see these issues actually playing out in that particular sector. So, if we can also think of political economy as just another example of critical theory, this really critiques the commodification of welfare, and how people get to be turned into commodities and things which can be simply sold in the workplace, in the marketplace. So this highlights how some human service organizations, particularly in the aged care and health sector, get to operate with profit as a motive, actually when they are meant to be functioning on a not-for-profit basis. And this really raises questions about whether the primary goal of human services is to provide, the human services they claim to be providing, or just to generate income like any other firm. Again, so this is really what you are trying to do when you engage with critical theory. You are trying to critique, you are trying to challenge existing power dynamics, and you are trying to really suggest new alternative of doing things. So if we can think of feminism, and as I said, this is involving many different types of theories. This absolutely fits well within critical theory due to its focus on gender and power relations. So, critical feminism examines how gender relations are structured within organizations, and which gender is gets to be marginalized, which gender gets to be holding privileges, and we can even expand this to take it to queer theories when it comes to sexual diversity and so on and so forth. So under critical theory, you might still consider things like race. We have what is known as critical race theory. It can be one of the theory or one of the theoretical lens you choose to work with. And again, that's about racism as one of the core mark of identity, which is often associated with marginalization in human service organizations. So the question here is really critical theory encourages us to ask questions such as who benefits from the system or from the organizations, and who gets to be disadvantaged, who gets to be marginalized. The other questions we might ask if we are engaging with this theory is how are resources, power, and opportunities distributed? And who gets to benefit from those, and who gets to be marginalized? So if we can think of the example I gave of the Avalon Care, we might ask questions such as why personal carers are underpaid and how funding models affect care quality. So these questions, again, will just help us really uncover systemic inequities and consider how broader political and economic forces shape organizational practice. Critical theory is just really about challenging power relations and trying to understand who benefits and who gets to be excluded from the existing power structures. So, and again, under critical theory, there are different schools of thoughts, but the most dominant one is the Frankfurt School of Thought, which emerged in the recent decades. So, but really want to consider how these might be helpful in doing your assessment. So the risk theory is another way of looking at human service organizations. But the core idea behind risk theory is that it just challenges the trend we often see in human service organizations to transform practices from needs-based support to clients to defensive risk avoidance and accountability discourses. So if you've studied already your child, youth, and family course, you might have spent a lot of time really trying to understand risk assessment. And this is what many human service organizations are doing often. So they are really focusing very much on risks and how to avoid risks and how to maintain accountability. But the risk theory is really calling for challenging this way of doing things. And it calls, of course, of doing it calls for doing risk analysis, but in a systematic way, trying to identify the risks, trying to assess for risks and develop mitigation plan and governance of risks to enable actually informed decisions and reliance, but just not to comply with existing policies. So the risk theory is trying to challenge this idea, and this trend we often see that we are responding to risks rather than considering, um, you know, the broader and political context in which these risks are happening. So risk theories just really examines how organizations balance clients' rights to self-determination with concerns or risks to safety and accountability. So if we can think of an example here, while everyone takes risks in daily life, we can think of and I'm thinking about the Avalon case here again. It's assumed that older adults and people with disabilities are often denied, really often denied the same right to take risks, and even the same right to autonomy, to be free, to be independent, due to the perceived vulnerability. And again, you can see here the risk playing out in the way we treat people. Um, in those particular settings. So we are trying to deconstruct the way we think about risks. We are trying to challenge. It's not really denying or trying to just overlook the risks, but it's another way of looking at risks in a critical way by trying to challenge the anxiety we often have around those risks and responding accordingly. And definitely, there are many questions you might ask when you are being driven by a risk theory mindset. Questions such as how is risk perceived within the organizations? Does risk take on the life of somebody? Um, does it take on a life on its own? So, what strategies are employed to manage these risks? Are there prompts, proportionate and disproportionate, um, you know, balance between how we think about risks and what we end up actually doing? And what are the implications really in the lives of our clients? And if we can think of the Avalon case, a clear example of thinking in terms of risk theory can be how might the organization decide to allocate resources to older people, the mentally ill, and the homeless people by prioritizing those deemed most at risk. And on what basis could or would these decisions be made? So again, risk theory is just another theory really, which is adopting a more critical lens to how we think about risk, how we assess them, and how we respond to those risks where they emerge. So finally, we also have post-colonial theories, and you might find different words being used for this. Colleagues are now using very often the word anti-colonial theory, with the understanding that colonialism is not in the past, it's something which is still with us, and we need to be challenging it as much as we can in our practice. Another way, we really need to be resistance to any form of colonialism and racism wherever we work, and trying to to respond to people's needs with an anti-colonial mindset. So the whole idea here is really, again, to challenge colonialism, to challenge racism, and ultimately to challenge the ongoing impact of colonization to indigenous people. So what I really mean by indigenous people here, I don't mean only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but I mean broadly all those people who have been affected in one way or another by colonization, whether it's the African people you work with, whether it's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues you work with, whether it's, anybody really who comes from this background where colonization is part of their intergenerational experience. So if you use the post-colonial theory, and I'm just using post-colonial for the sake of this course, but it's more than that because we have this understanding that colonization is not in the past. It is still ongoing, alive and well, and still with us in many ways. So what you are really trying to do is to build cultural safety. You are trying to be culturally responsive, and you are really trying to focus on and challenging problems associated with colonization and the empire wherever they emerge. So post-colonial, indigenous, and again, anti-racist theories are very much based on this idea that specific groups of people have been the subject of marginalization and ongoing intergenerational disadvantage. And we are trying to respond to that as much as we can by promoting cultural safety, by promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion, and of course, by trying as much as we can to repair the um, the consequences of colonization. And there are several questions we can ask. And of course, you have this example from the Maori. You will see, for example, if you go to New Zealand, you'll find that in many human services, including even in universities and non-human service organizations, you'll still find people trying to embrace the indigenous Maori's language as much as they can. If you get an email from um, a colleague from New Zealand, you'll find them, for example, using the word kia kora or something like that. And the idea here really is just trying to be repairing, these symbolic subjugations which were created by colonization by helping indigenous people or just by trying to make, the indigenous culture somehow reflected in how we do things even today. And the idea here for you as human service workers is to be culturally responsive and reflecting more and more cultural safety. So some of the questions you might ask if this is a theory you are engaging with are questions such as, are staff culturally responsive? Well, now we use the word cultural competency. It's such a contested one. Um, you might want to use the word culturally responsive instead of competency, because competency is something which is being challenged in human service organizations broadly. People also use the word cultural safety, and again, you might want to look at how is that playing out in action. So you might want to also ask questions such as whether cultural safety principles are embedded in the organization's policies and guidelines, and whether there is a recognition of history of operation among, people affected by operation, colonization, and marginalization. And all of the other principles really of respecting indigenous people's right to autonomy, to self-determination, and all the other questions of all the other ethical questions that this might raise. So if we can think of the Avalon case, and I really leave that to you, um, try to reflect on how might Avalon Care move towards being culturally sensitive or culturally responsive in the way, in the different developments you have in that case study. So thank you very much. I'll see you soon.